Welcome everybody to the channel. Glad you stopped by. Now today I'm actually going to talk a little bit about how to get a proper exposure, and I'm mainly going to deal with manual because I tell my students a lot of times they want to use manual in certain situations. Now most of the time, if I'm shooting wildlife, things like that, I will definitely be using aperture priority or shutter priority depending on which one I need, but most of the time I stick with the aperture priority. But when I do macro work, I almost always go to manual. And that way I have control of depth of field, I have control of the shutter, I have control of all of that stuff. But the main thing is, how do you get a proper exposure? So right now I have it on aperture priority. You see AV at the top there. At 3.5, when I take this picture of these flowers, we have a nice exposure here. And when I go back here, our exposure level meter right there is on 0. It's on the middle. So we have a good exposure. Now, in aperture priority, as I change the aperture, it's automatically going to change the shutter. Like you see 1/30th here, and as I go up here to 10 and 11, it changes it. This could probably incur camera shake because of the shutter speed. So we move here and we get the proper exposure. And you notice that exposure level index has not changed at all as I move this through on aperture priority, because it makes the adjustment for you. When I go to manual here, you see that we have a dark image here because I have to control all of the stuff that lets the light in. So I have to control the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO. So in this case, I'm going to bring my shutter down a little bit, and I'll bring my aperture down quite a bit here. And we can see that at 1/25th at 3.5, according to my exposure levels meter, we are at a proper exposure. Now, just to make sure that we are, we can also use another meter in here to help us get the proper exposure, and that's called our histogram. And our histogram there is up in the corner here, and you can see that we have our stuff that is pretty much in the middle of the histogram. And the histogram is mainly used to tell if you're clipping on the lower end, dark areas, shadow areas, or you're clipping on the higher end, highlights. And so what that means is that as I move my shutter up, you see that it starts to get overexposed, and you see that the clipping starts to happen on the right side. That's telling us that we're losing pixels there. Those pixels are pure white. When you put them in Photoshop, no matter how much you darken them down using exposure or anything else, you're not going to get anything out of that. There's going to be no detail in there. So when I start going the opposite way, and you can see that on our exposure levels index that we're getting down to -1, -2 here, and then as we get into the -3 territory, we start to lose stuff on the lower end of the shadow end. We lose pixels there, which means that those pixels are completely black. We can never bring them back. So by using a combination of both of these, we can see that we can place it in the middle of our histogram, and we're also in the middle of our exposure level meter right there. So that tells us that we have a proper exposure on everything. So if I take this picture right now, we can see that we have a pretty good exposure there. And again, I can do equivalent exposures, which if you haven't watched that, you can watch it in the other video up here. But I can use equivalent exposures to change this around to whatever I need. If I want maximum depth of field, or if I just want shallow depth of field with a blurred background. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit about when you go into manual, how you set manual up to get a proper exposure when you first get in there. And then once you have that proper exposure, if you increase the aperture or the shutter by 1 stop, you decrease the other one by 1 stop. So if you go higher on the aperture, you go to a lower number on the shutter speed. If you go to a higher number on the shutter speed, you go to a lower number on the aperture. As you move them around, depending on which one you move around. You can also incorporate the ISO in there to help you out, make the sensor a little bit more sensitive so that it can absorb more light quickly. That can also work. It does introduce noise, but we can fix that in post relatively easy. So that's a quick little video on how to get set up into manual mode and get your proper exposure. Even if you don't use anything else, just what's on the camera, in the camera there, we have plenty of things there to show us how to get a proper exposure in manual mode. So don't be afraid to go to manual mode when you're shooting macro, at night, in the studio, certain things you need to use manual mode. This is the way to get a proper exposure on it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around this long. Stay tuned for the next video.